Hey guys, Eugene Mulero, transportation reporter at Transport Topics, and I'm here with my colleague Kellie Mejdrich, appropriations reporter with CQ Roll Call. And Kellie, you and I were at the Senate Appropriations Committee markup last Thursday. They took on the transportation funding bill for fiscal 2017, and in that bill, it's of interest to the trucking industry because not only did the chairwoman of the transportation subcommittee, Susan Collins, ensured that the bill had a provision calling on DOT to advance the speed limiters proposed rule for motor carriers, but it also aimed at capping the work week allowable hours for truckers at 73. So 73 hours, that would be the maximum hours that truckers could work. We saw aspects of the trucking industry led by American Trucking Associations really come out in favor of that. But you've reported and we've heard around that there's been some groups that didn't really like that.
Yeah, this is the third year now that the Appropriations Committee has inserted a provision blocking this Department of Transportation rulemaking that makes changes to the trucker rest requirements rules.
Yeah.
And this year, in a kind of interesting twist, the trucking industry and other trucking lobbying groups are saying that the provision as drafted in the 2016 omnibus, remember that was the catch-all spending measure at the end of last year, apparently there was something of a drafting error in there, that they fear that if there is not a change to the provision in this year's appropriations bill, it's possible that some unintended consequences could be that truckers have to revert to older rest requirements.
Correct.
Again, remember this is all contingent on a Department of Transportation study about the rule, the results of which are in limbo. That's a whole different discussion. But safety groups were really upset that the provision wasn't addressed in an amendment or anything like that during the markup.
There was no public discussion on it. There was no hearing about it.
But this is the third year we've had such a provision, and we also have, Chairwoman Collins, Ranking Member Reed. They've done a lot of work to try to kind of address member requests prior to the markup, and when we got to the markup, it was less than 10 minutes of amendment debate. So anything we see on this will probably have to wait for the floor, if anything.
And Susan Collins, she alluded to this. She said that she doesn't expect this bill to get some quick, easy approval on the floor. And you and I have heard from, senators that, a Democrat, Cory Booker, may come out against the HOS language in this bill when it reaches the floor. And he might be joined by Dianne Feinstein or Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. What are you hearing about, the bill moving forward?
So yeah, it's a little bit up in the air as to when the Senate T-HUD bill would reach the floor. For this year, in terms of the appropriations process, it's kind of unusual because usually the House kicks off floor action on appropriations bills. But what you're seeing is that this week and last week with the Senate, they've already started floor action on their first appropriations bill, energy, water. And they have these leftover kind of legislative vehicles that allow them to kind of kickstart floor action on appropriations where typically they have to wait for the House. What they're doing is kind of a really obscure procedural tactic of taking old, unused appropriations bills from last year that are kind of sitting at the desk in the Senate, and they're subbing in their new appropriations measures as a means to move forward. So on the Senate side, we could see floor action on the transportation HUD measure sometime in the near future, but in the House, that's a little bit more delayed because of wrangling over the budget in that chamber, which is kind of stalling floor action on appropriations bills. So yeah, even if we do get to the floor, as you remember last year, the transportation HUD measure was kind of, floor procedure was kind of flattened on that measure as Senator Rand Paul protested the fact that floor managers wouldn't allow him an amendment barring housing assistance to refugees from certain Middle Eastern countries. This followed a whole kind of debate over the Syrian refugee crisis and what the U.S.'s role was. And so sometimes kind of issues that the bill managers don't want to get into the bill end up there. So that's fully possible that that could happen again with transportation HUD this year.
And a quick reminder that these appropriation funding bills are what are termed as must-pass legislation, so that's why many lawmakers see these as vehicles to attach, personal riders, special procedures moving forward.
And you don't know how many people are going to try to make an attempt to hitch a ride on these bills.
Exactly.
At this point in the process, it's not even really known how many bills we're going to get to the president's desk if we even get that far.
Exactly.
But Republican leadership in both chambers has made it a priority to try to return to the regular appropriations process so that they can have heavier vetting of these bills. But with the conventions in the summer, long recess for campaigning, we're all kind of watching this to see how many can they really get in this time period. But by the time September rolls around, most people watching the process are pretty confident that most of the work is going to be put toward establishing or putting together legislation for a continuing resolution.
Exactly. Toward the end of the year.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which is what we saw last year in December.
So while everyone kind of thought that this year was going to be a big, different year for appropriations, and transportation appropriations included in there, it's looking now like we're getting a little bit closer to what we saw last year. The difference is very, very early appropriations action in both chambers and committee, and very early on the floor in the Senate.
Yeah, and just FYI that I'm hearing that on the House side, the House Appropriations Committee will likely mark up their transportation funding bill sometime in mid-May. And this goes back to what you were saying, that Speaker Paul Ryan has been calling for regular order on these measures.
And it'll be very interesting to see what Transportation HUD's allocation is. In the budget agreement that was signed by the president last year, they set the discretionary top lines for defense and non-defense, but there's been disagreement in the House over whether that top line is appropriate. So Appropriations Chairman Hal Rogers has been going one by one assigning spending levels to various bills, and Transportation HUD, as we heard in the Senate, had some issues with the rising cost of rental assistance. The way that they kind of made ends meet was really unique, and it will be interesting to see if the House does what the Senate did. One of the major things that kind of kept their bill running smoothly was they benefited from a huge rescission in contract authority from the federal aid highway program. They receded some $2.2 billion, and that opened up a lot of discretionary spending for the bill and allowed them to address the housing costs while not, delivering a huge blow to transportation programs. So I imagine the House would probably want to benefit from that as well. It was in the president's budget request, and so that's something I'll be looking for.
Terrific. Kellie, we're going to watch all your reporting at CQ.com, and please, we'll follow you on Twitter. And we want to thank everybody for tuning in, and check out Capital Agenda at ttnews.com on Tuesdays. Thanks.